This move establishes central control and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, preparing for various classical opening systems and influencing the pawn structure. This move, developing a knight towards the center, prepares for various dynamic Indian defenses and allows black to postpone committing their central pawn structure, maintaining flexibility against white's initial central pawn push. This move, 2, c4, immediately challenges black's central knight and aims to control key central squares, preparing to establish a strong pawn center often seen in openings like the Queen's Indian defense or Nimzo Indian defense. This move establishes a solid pawn structure, preparing to develop the king's bishop and control central squares, while also opening the path for the queen and king's bishop. This move prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop, aiming for long-term control of the dark squares and a flexible setup often seen in Catalan-style openings. This move establishes a solid pawn center, directly challenging white's intention to build a fianchettoed kingside structure and aiming for symmetrical central control. The fianchettoed bishop on g2 now exerts pressure along the long diagonal, aiming to control important central squares and support white's developing pieces in the Catalan opening framework. Developing the bishop to e7 completes the kingside fianchetto setup, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for kingside castling, which is a standard and solid response in this Catalan formation. This move develops a knight towards the center, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing for kingside castling, which is a standard and solid continuation within the Catalan opening structure. Castling here is a sound defensive maneuver, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks for future central or kingside operations. Castling kingside is a natural developing move, completing kingside pawn protection and activating the rook for potential central action. By capturing on c4, black relinquishes the central pawn advantage, often seen in queen's pawn openings, aiming to challenge white's central control and potentially develop actively on the queenside. This move supports the recapture of the c4 pawn, preparing to develop the queen to a more active central square and contest the d5 diagonal. This move, 7, a6, is a common response in Catalan structures, preparing to undermine white's queenside expansion and potentially create a queenside majority. This move recaptures the pawn on c4, opening the queen's diagonal and preparing to challenge black's central pawn structure while developing initiative. This move boldly challenges white's queen and initiates a queenside pawn advance, aiming to gain space and potentially disrupt white's development. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the now open c-file and potentially support further central expansion while avoiding the immediate pressure from black's advancing queenside pawns. Developing the bishop to b-flat7 activates the piece along the long diagonal, preparing to exert pressure on white's central pawn structure and potentially target the c3 square. This move aims to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal and connect the rooks, preparing to challenge black's queenside pawn majority. This move challenges white's bishop and aims to control the d5 square, potentially preparing to exchange pieces to alleviate black's slight space disadvantage. The queen retreats from the aggressive pawn push on b5, repositioning to c1 to defend the c4 pawn and prepare to recapture on c4 if black's bishop on e4 is dislodged. This pawn advance exploits white's misplaced queen and aims to gain space on the queenside while potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This move challenges black's bishop on e4, seeking to disrupt their coordination and potentially create pawn weaknesses. This move challenges white's aggressively placed bishop, forcing it to retreat or trade, which aims to ease black's queenside development and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. This move resolves black's slight spatial pressure and opens the g-file for potential future kingside play after the exchange. This exchange breaks black's pawn structure but opens the bishop's diagonal, forcing white to reconsider their queen's development and potentially creating endgame advantages for black if the pawns can be unified. This move develops the knight to a more active central square, preparing to support a kingside advance or transition to the queenside if opportunities arise. The bishop returns to d5, contesting the light-squared diagonal and preparing to exchange off white's active bishop on g5, simplifying the position and improving black's piece coordination. This move abandons the developed queen for a second time, indicating a strategic retreat from the queenside complications and a readiness to reposition the queen for better central influence or defense. This move neatly redeploys the knight to a central outpost, preparing to contest the d5 square and potentially support a future c5 pawn advance for queenside pressure. This move initiates a central pawn break, aiming to disrupt black's cramped position and open lines for white's pieces, particularly the light-squared bishop. The bishop retreats to b7 to avoid being exchanged and to maintain its influence on the long diagonal, while also defending the c6 square. This move activates the rook, preparing to contest the d-file and support potential pawn advances, while also clearing the way for potential piece redeployments. The recapture of the bishop on e7 completes the recapture of white's pawn and prepares to develop the knight to a more active square, likely c6, to support the queenside pawn push. The knight's repositioning to c4 aims to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially exploit weaknesses along the c-file and d-file. This move challenges white's central pawn structure and aims to open lines for black's pieces, particularly the bishop on b7, by creating a dynamic pawn majority on the queenside. This move breaks open the c-file, offering white a chance to exploit the increased activity for their rooks and potentially create tactical threats against black's king. This move prepares to recapture the pawn on c5 with the queen, aiming to regain material equality and maintain active piece play in the center. This move initiates a dynamic pawn sacrifice to open the d-file, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and create attacking chances against the enemy king. This move recaptures the pawn and simplifies the position, opening the d-file for white's rook and maintaining an advantage in space due to black's slightly awkward pawn structure on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to an advanced square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses while controlling key central squares. This move continues the tactical skirmish, aiming to exploit the open diagonal and potentially trap the knight on b6 by forcing it to move. This move, nxa8, is a tactical blunder that loses the knight as it falls into a discovered attack by white's queen on the b4 pawn and simultaneously fails to account for the knight's own defense, indicating a miscalculation of the complex interactions on the queenside. This move recaptures the knight, aiming to restore material balance after white's tactical gambit, but it allows white to maintain a significant positional advantage due to the compromised kingside pawn structure. This move repositions the rook to the open c-file, aiming to exploit the pawn deficit and potential weaknesses in black's queenside pawns while also preparing to defend the vulnerable c2 pawn. The rook now occupies the open c-file, directly challenging white's rook and aiming to disrupt white's control over this crucial central file. This knight maneuver skillfully repositions the knight to a more active central square, threatening the enemy queen and potentially disrupting black's coordination while reinforcing white's own central presence. This move recaptures the pawn but concedes the initiative and allows white's knights to gain favorable squares, particularly the knight on d4, which is now well placed to support an attack on black's kingside. This exchange of queens simplifies the position, leading to an endgame where white aims to leverage their active pieces against black's somewhat passive structure. This capture simplifies the position, resolving the immediate tension after the queens were exchanged and placing black's bishop on a more active diagonal. The knight relocates to a more active square, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure after the queens are exchanged. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, controlling the long diagonal and preparing to contest the d-file, aiming to restore some piece activity after white's recent simplification. This move initiates a pawn break in the center, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and create potential attacking opportunities on the kingside or in the center as the position simplifies. This move forces a queen trade, simplifying the position and leading to an endgame where black aims to exploit the doubled pawns on the c-file and white's slightly less active pieces. This move recaptures the knight, simplifying the position and leading into a slightly more favorable endgame for white due to black's slightly awkward pawn structure on the queenside. This move retreats the bishop to its starting square, effectively abandoning the fight for the crucial c-file and the potential pressure it offered. This move aims to activate the bishop by bringing it to a more central square, potentially preparing for further pawn advances or piece development in the endgame. This move prepares to expand on the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn or at least gain space against white's potentially cramped pieces. This move is a logical step to centralize the king, offering it protection from potential checks and preparing to activate it in the endgame as the remaining pieces are exchanged. The bishop repositions to d4, aiming to control key central squares and potentially challenge white's pawn structure should they advance further. The knight moves to d3 to support the e5 pawn's advance and prepare for potential expansion on the kingside or a central pawn break. This move challenges white's central pawn structure by creating a passed pawn on the e-file for black, aiming to disrupt white's piece coordination and potentially open lines for the bishop. This pawn capture opens the e-file and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses around the king and freeing white's pieces for more active play. The pawn grab on the kingside opens up black's king and creates weaknesses that white can exploit, though black aims to use the open g-file for counterplay. This pawn push opens a potential avenue for the king to escape the center and activate the g-file for rook operations, while also reinforcing the kingside structure. The king becomes more active, aiming to support the pawn advances on the kingside and potentially participate in the central struggle. This move shores up the kingside pawn structure, creating a more solid defensive perimeter for the king and preparing to potentially advance the pawns further on the kingside. This move repositions the king to a more central and active square, aiming to participate in the endgame battle for control of the central files and potential passed pawn advances. The king begins an active journey towards the center, seeking to participate in the endgame and potentially support pawn pushes. This move seeks to centralize the king, activating it for the endgame and potentially supporting further pawn advances or challenging white's kingside majority. The king actively joins the center, aiming to support the d-pawn and potentially participate in future pawn advances. bd7 repositions the bishop to a more active square, supporting the pawn on c5 and potentially preparing for future pawn breaks or to contest the open diagonal if white advances the e-pawn further. This move aims to secure the kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances like g4 gram5 to gain space and restrict black's bishop. This move reactivates the bishop, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king and potentially create counterplay. On the queenside, this move aims to create a more solid pawn structure and free up the g-pawn to advance, potentially opening lines against black's king or creating weaknesses in the opponent's camp. The bishop retreats to safety, maintaining its influence on the long diagonal and preparing to defend the pawn on f6 if white attempts to advance the g-pawn further. The king's repositioning to g3 is a sensible defensive consolidation, bringing it closer to the center and away from potential pawn thrusts or tactical threats along the now open kingside. This pawn thrust challenges white's central control and aims to create dynamic play by opening lines for black's pieces, specifically targeting the g4 pawn. This pawn capture opens the g-file for white's rook, creating attacking possibilities and potentially exploiting black's underdeveloped kingside. This move, exf5, is forced as white threatened to win a pawn with gxf5, and recapturing opens the g-file for potential future play while also solidifying black's central pawn structure somewhat. White's bishop activates to b7, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially support a future kingside attack or pressure black's pawn structure. The move aims to reposition the bishop from the vulnerable d7 square to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting pawn advances or creating threats against white's kingside. This move aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting weaknesses on the kingside or supporting a kingside pawn push, while also preparing to defend against black's advanced queenside pawn. The bishop moves to c3, reinforcing the a5 pawn and preparing to contest the active c-file for potential counterplay. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn push on the kingside and potentially create attacking chances by targeting the bishop on c3.